Hello, I'm here today with Stephanie Love Patterson, who works at Connections for Abused Women and Their Children. Today, we're going to be discussing breaking the silence surrounding the issue of reproductive coercion post the overturning of Roe v. Wade in order to encourage open dialogue in today's society to promote awareness, understanding, and empathy, of course. So today we're going to be gaining your perspective on specifically IPV and how it plays a specific role in reproductive coercion and how policies and other legal framework can be informed to challenge this issue. So before we dive into the questions, I kind of wanted to first ask you to give us some insight into your current role at the Connections for Abused Women and Their Children. Additionally, I'm just curious about any academic background or areas of study that you may have pursued in the past or going to pursue in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. I have been at Connections for Abused Women and Their Children, or CAWC, for 25 years. And I started out actually in our hospital program. So it's kind of interesting that we're talking about this program where we saw a lot of reproductive coercion related to intimate partner violence. I've been with the agency for 25 years, 10 of those years as executive director. I've now stepped down as executive director, and I'm doing some consulting for the organization for a while until I figure out my next place. I'm an Illinois certified domestic violence professional here in the state of Illinois. And just like a bit about my background, I've been doing this work in the field of violence against women for over 30 years. I started out in '85 as a sexual assault advocate volunteer at Michael Reese Hospital, which is long gone now.
Awesome. This should be really awesome and informational. So let's dive right into the question. So first, I kind of want to, if you could provide a brief overview of what reproductive coercion entails and how it may manifest in any type of abusive relationship, whether I've discussed with other women about how it may manifest with parents as well, with their children. So any kind of abusive relationship and how reproductive coercion manifests in those.
So reproductive coercion is really, there's a lot of dynamics as it relates to domestic violence. And oftentimes people just think of the hitting, kicking, slapping, punching, and those sorts of things. But there's threats and intimidation, which can also be used in this type of coercion as well. If you don't give me what I want when I want, I will force you to have sex. And then oftentimes comes along the dynamic of not allowing victims to use birth control and things like that. There's emotional and psychological abuse. There is economic abuse, you name it. There's that. And sort of the reproductive coercion sort of is woven throughout all of that, because let's say we're talking about economic abuse. If you don't have money for prescriptions to get like birth control pills or to get other types of services or products that are out there to prevent pregnancy, then and you're not giving any money, then that can be difficult. And in many places it's free, but in some places there is a fee for some of the medication that's out there.
Yeah.
Perpetrators of domestic violence use a number of tactics in abusive relationships, and oftentimes rape is a big part of that. We have talked to a lot of individuals who say, my partner says, because I pay the bills, because I keep a roof over your head, because we're husband and wife, or we're partners, a lot of different things. I get to have sex when I want to, however I want to, and despite whether or not you want to, or if you feel like it, or for things that make you feel uncomfortable. And unfortunately, a lot of times it doesn't in pregnancy. And again, they're not even given the opportunity to take advantage of the many options that are available to individuals who are pregnant and maybe don't want to carry the baby full term, or even like adoption issues and things like that. Sometimes that's because of a dynamic of isolation. They can't even get to the hospital. So in my work at Stroger Hospital, we often saw individuals in the reproductive health services clinic who would literally sneak to the clinic or to the hospital to get an abortion, just because they knew that this was another way, having a baby was another way to sort of keep this person in their lives for at least 18 years or longer and things like that.
Yeah, I kind of want to dive into, I know you talked about working in a hospital and obviously being an advocate against domestic violence and against sexual assault. How prevalent would you say that reproductive coercion is in America? I know me personally, when I started this project, I didn't know a lot about it. And I don't think I learned a lot about it in my studies, getting my master's and an undergraduate. So I know we talked about common tactics, but does someone exert control over a partner's reproductive choices that you have seen personally, if you can speak on that?
Sure. So how it's played out is I remember this one story where a woman told me that her partner, who he was her boyfriend, he used to beat her up even if he just thought that she was using birth control.
Mhm.
One time she ran away from him. She went to her home. Her boyfriend convinced her parents to let him in. It's like, oh, we just had a little fight. I really want to come in and kind of smooth things over. And the parents, unfortunately, agreed and let him in. And he happened to see an empty birth control pill container in her garbage can. And he severely beat her because he actually told her, and this was really chilling. I've been doing this work for a really long time, and you hear things that just sort of make your hair stand on end. And he said, the reason I don't want you to use birth control is because I always want to have a reason to be in your life. I want you to get pregnant. And he knew that that was, a very effective tactic to do exactly what he said, have a reason to always be in her life. And when we met her at the hospital, she was there trying to make a really difficult decision about whether or not to keep the baby or not keep the baby. It was interesting because oftentimes we meet folks who don't have a whole lot of support to get away from the perpetrator. And this particular woman did, but it was in another state.
Mm.
And going to help her get a job and everything. And so part of the decision-making process was, how am I going to be able to start a new life with a brand new baby? And so she was there trying to make that difficult decision. So that's one way.
Mhm.
Again, is by beating someone because just at the thought of them using birth control. And then again, just the act of rape is huge, and we see that a lot, and we do a lot of patient education, in fact, that says that even if there's a marriage license, even if this person pays your bills or puts the roof over your head, no still means no.
Mhm.
But sometimes people grow up and they think that, no, we're in a relationship, I have to have sex with this person, even though I don't want to. And there's also birth control sabotage,
Mm.
where sometimes perpetrators will hide a person's birth control. Or I've even heard of situations where, they'll take birth control pills and try to put some other things. It's like, you know what, we're going to take them out of this original container, put them in another bottle to make it easier, and they're aspirin or something
Yeah.
like that in there. So there's definitely things like that, or preventing someone from even going to their doctor's appointment to
Mhm.
access birth control.
Yeah, wow. That is very chilling. Thank you for sharing that. Um, I kind of also want to dive into, we briefly touched on support services. What are the potential consequences and impacts of reproductive coercion and intimate partner violence of survivors, both physically and emotionally in the long term?
In the long term, it's kind of like the story that I mentioned. So
Mhm.
this woman, and to this day, I don't know what decision she ultimately made on whether or not she was going to keep her baby or terminate the pregnancy. But that emotional impact
Yeah.
was at that time huge because, as she said to me, this little baby, had played no role in her getting pregnant. And she had a lot of feelings about terminating pregnancy and about things like that. So, but also she knew it would be a huge struggle for
Yeah.
her to have a newborn baby. So the emotional, and I'm sure whatever decision she made, the emotional impact lingered, because also you have to deal with the fact that the person that you're looking at, this baby, if you have give birth to the baby, oftentimes is a reminder of the assault
Yeah.
you've experienced. And then also, again, there's the physical abuse. There's a dynamic where in some instances where women do become pregnant, even with this person's baby. One, they oftentimes accuse them of having sex with someone else, and it's like, this isn't even my baby, and so they
Mm.
abuse them that way. Or they will say, crazy things like, this baby is taking away all this attention, taking away time from me and things like that. And they use that as another reason to justify the abuse that they experience. And so oftentimes there's the reproductive sabotage, there's the reproductive health sabotage, there's the sexual assault, but then on the other end of that, there's the abuse because they blame so many issues on the victim.
Kind of piggybacking off of that, what kind of barriers do women specifically, but all genders, any survivor of reproductive coercion face when trying to get help for their situation, or if they're seeking any type of, it could be medical or friends? What kind of barriers do you typically see that these people face?
There's a lot of barriers. And if I could go back to your other question for a minute too, one of the other consequences, reproductive coercion and if someone gets pregnant, is the economic
Yeah.
piece of where now you have a baby and maybe you're already struggling. And I'll
Mhm.
say that as one of the other barriers, just in terms of seeking services. A lot of times victims and survivors are the ones that they have to give up everything. They have
Mm.
to give up where they work. They have to give up where they live. They have to give up where their children live. They have to give up so many different things and in essence start over. Well, that's not easy.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of economic challenges that come with that, or barriers, as you put it. There's also barriers of them reaching out for help and the perpetrator finding out that they've reached out for help.
Mm.
There's the retaliation that happens. And so victims hear all day long, if you tell anybody about what's going on, if you try to leave me, I'll hurt you or I'll even kill you. And oftentimes we hear, if I could put a pin in that, when you hear about individuals like some of these young women who are found and they're killed and they're pregnant, oftentimes I first think, I bet you this was a victim of domestic violence, because there's high rates of murder in that for those women, unfortunately.
Mm.
Users will say, and we always tell folks at CWC, and in other organizations, that if someone says that they're going to kill you, to believe them, because usually they very much are intended to do it, if not right at that moment, at some point.
Mm.
Some other barriers to leaving is just kind of the unknown. A lot of victims will say, where do I go? And even people will ask a question, well, why don't you just leave? And they still do ask that question in
Yeah.
2024. And oftentimes the response is, leave and go where?
Mm.
There are not enough shelters in the city of Chicago, for instance, to be able to keep individuals safe. And so if the shelters are full, then where they're going to go? Where are they going to go? Sometimes it's too dangerous to go to family members or friends. Or they may even say, yeah, I'll help you, but gosh, I wish I could help you, but I
Mm.
don't want him, or her to know where I live and then get involved and put myself
Yeah.
and my family in danger. So there's lots of barriers. And some individuals will say, kind of, the devil I know is better than the devil I don't know. If I leave, I'm off into kind of this the abyss of not really knowing what's gonna happen to me. And
Yeah.
going into shelters is not an easy thing either. Some people are like, yeah, you can just go to a shelter. Well, if you get in,
Mm.
our shelter, for instance, is a 42-bed shelter, and that means individuals are living at that facility with all these strangers and all these situations that are so different to them than what they're used to, and that can be really difficult.
Yeah. It's I totally agree with your comment about the fact that we're still saying today, oh, why don't you just leave? It's a lot
Mhm.
harder than that. And I don't think people who are not in that situation, they don't really understand how hard it is.
Mhm.
It's great that you brought that up. I know we talked about shelters briefly. What are the strategies and or resources besides shelters that are available for survivors to regain their autonomy and or be reintegrated back into society safely, that whether it be in the city of Chicago or nationally, that you think are great?
Some of the options are, and that's a really good point because not everybody wants to go to shelter. Shelters
Mhm.
are not for everybody. One option is an order of protection. So there's legal remedies, which also aren't for everyone for
Mhm.
many reasons. But for some, being able to go to a domestic violence courthouse, and I always recommend going with a domestic violence advocate to help navigate through that really difficult system. But orders of protection can be good for some, and I emphasize can be. Doesn't work for everyone. Sometimes getting an order of protection can just make the anger intensify with
Yeah.
abuse. And that's where we also see some individuals who are killed because the perpetrator realizes that they're taking their power back. And
Mhm.
that's not something that they're really ready to relinquish. There's also a lot of safety planning where some people will bypass the legal system, will bypass going to shelter. They'll talk to an advocate and we can kind of help them with just safety planning to get away. Like in the story I mentioned earlier, some people actually do have folks that they can maybe stay with, and maybe it's on a whole nother side of town, or maybe it's in another country or another state, and we can provide um strategies to help them get to other places where they can be safe as well.
Yeah. Have you seen in the past few years, or do you see in the future any effective advocacy efforts or policy changes that you believe should be addressed in order to prevent the future of reproductive coercion or it continue happening in domestic violence cases, sexual assault cases?
Not so much, not as much change in policy as I'd like it to see. And then, of course, we're having this whole conversation about, Roe versus Wade, and some of
Mhm.
the horrible policies that some of the at the state level are happening that really unfortunately supports reproductive coercion. I think what some of the things that need to happen is just real, first of all, just an understanding of what it is and what that means. I'm gonna insert my little 2 cent soapbox thing is to take
Please.
these conversations away from some of these men who have
Yeah.
no, no business
Yeah.
legislating things about women's bodies, and really push it over to people who understand it and who get it. And I shouldn't say that because not all men
Yeah.
um,
I understand.
as that, but you get what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
totally.
And then I think also just funding to help with like Planned Parenthood and some other places that deal with reproduction options and things like that, so that there's more spaces and communities where individuals can go, and maybe they have to sneak and go there, kind of like in the story that I mentioned
Mhm.
earlier, where they're like, oh, I'm just going to go to the grocery store, but instead they're going to go a couple of steps down to a place where they can get, birth control and things like that. And I think just overall, sort of the other just policy as a change on thoughts about women. I think women are still some of the most disrespected and valued individuals in our society, unfortunately. And so there's not a lot of, uh, how do I want to say, there's not a lot of maybe emphasis. There's not a lot of attention to issues like this. And I think
Yeah.
people just don't, and I think better education around reproductive coercion, I think that's key. I
Mhm.
think again, helping to send a message to victims and survivors, well, to even before it gets to that, as a preventative effort, to be able to tell women no means no.
Yeah.
uh, as I mentioned earlier, and that they do have agency and right over their own body and the use of birth control in their lives. I think that's one start. And then as much as we can kind of provide funding to schools that can communicate that that
Mm.
message, and to other clinics and establishing community clinics and resources so that it's just more accessible.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think education is very, very important, especially with all of the education. We have all of social media now, and it's really important to understand misinformation and disinformation from what's actually happening. And I think there's a lot of ways that people can educate themselves nowadays, and they're choosing not to. That's obviously my soapbox, in my opinion.
Mhm.
But I wanted to touch very briefly kind of on the abortion topic and the overturning of Roe v. Wade, because with everything that's happening in the world right now, I feel that it's almost been slightly swept under the rug, and it's not been. Obviously, there's so much happening, and there's a lot of important changes happening in our world right now. Have you noticed a change in the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the case of reproductive coercion? Do you believe that there has been an uptick in it, or is it being more accepted now that Roe v. Wade has been overturned? Kind of wanted to get your opinion on that.
I think there's the fear
Yeah.
definitely exists. I think when you are looking at places like Planned Parenthood and other organizations that provide reproductive health services being under attack as well. So it's not even just the individual, but it's the medical teams that provide those services that are also under attack. It's creating more fear in victims and survivors of domestic violence, because at least before, if there was reproductive coercion, and someone got pregnant, they could go
Mhm.
to Planned Parenthood or someplace and get aborted. Now doctors are in fear of being charged
Yeah.
criminal if they provide those services. And then there's those horrible stories that we're hearing about individuals. I just heard last night someone had to be airlifted out of Idaho, I believe
I
it.
Yeah, that's what's being discussed in front of the Supreme Court now. It's crazy.
Yes, exactly. And so hearing things like that can put just so much more fear on top of the fear that was already there. And I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of victims and survivors of domestic violence. It's like, what are the consequences for me?
Yeah.
If I do get pregnant, or if I try to have an abortion, or if I try to take advantage of some of the other options out there, what's going to happen to me. And I think, when you have the government at the federal and state level that are saying all these chaotic 1864 kinds of um, thinking
Yeah.
about the issue, it really, I mean, I don't blame individuals for being afraid, and it's like we're rolling back the time,
Mhm.
rolling back times and stuff into the 1800s, where
Yeah.
people, thoughts about women were even less than what they are now, and they're taking
Yeah.
us back to that. Yeah.
It's crazy, the legal ramifications surrounding abortion and just reproductive health in general for women that I've never seen. I know I'm very young, but in my early life, like, it was very, very easy to have conversations about this. And now I'm noticing that it's very, very hard because there's so many legal issues surrounding it, and there's so many now new problems coming out and that we're reading about. It's very crazy.
And what this will do, some of the ramifications of these horrible laws, is they are going to force women into some of these horrible places that claim to do safe abortions, where they're,
Yeah.
going back to using, these inhumane kinds of instruments to perform abortions, and these unclean, kind of back alley kind
Yeah.
of places in order to get abortions. And that's such a fear, is the risk that they're putting women and children who are having to go through all of this. But for some individuals, they feel like this is my only choice.
That's it's really sad above anything else as a woman to watch all of this happen and keep hearing the stories being brought to the Supreme Court or it's very, very sad, I think. And it really affects, I think, all of us in the very different ways, obviously. But I
Mhm.
just wanted to say thank you so very much for taking the time today to speak with me. I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day, because I think this was a really great opportunity to learn about reproductive coercion, and it was very informational. And I think this is a very, very important conversation that I hope that us women and men continue to have in the future, especially now in the political state that we're in right now. So, hello everyone. I'm here today with Dr. Tracy White, who is currently a sociology professor and director of the Center of Health, Risk, and Society at American University in Washington, D.C. So today we're going to be discussing about breaking the silence surrounding the issue of reproductive coercion post the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and in order to encourage open dialogue in today's society to promote awareness and an understanding and empathy for women and people who identify as women going through this. So today we kind of want to gain your perspective on abortion and how it specifically plays into reproductive coercion and how policies and legal framework in today's society can be informed or changed regarding that topic. So before we dive in, I wanted to first ask you to give some insights into your current role and responsibilities within the area of reproductive coercion and abortion in America. Also, I'm just curious of your academic background and any areas of study that you have pursued in order to give the viewers kind of a understanding of where you're coming from.
Sure. So I have been, I'm a professor of sociology, and I've been at American University since July of last year. So this will be my second full year. And I have been a scholar of abortion in the United States for 30 years. I took a brief time off from I had been at the University of California, San Francisco for several decades, and then went to a private family foundation before coming to American University. My interest has always been in increased accessibility of abortion, and in particular, understanding how abortion operates as both sort of social matter, how we think about it, how we think about abortion stigma, how we think about abortion opinions, and how abortion is delivered as a healthcare service. So I have studies that sort of go the full range, but I am a U.S. scholar. I do a little work on comparative about the differences, but most of my work has been in the United States.
Thank you so much. Kind of wondering if you could provide an overview of how, with your insight in abortion, how reproductive coercion intersects with broader societal factors. So gender norms, power dynamics, and like socioeconomic status. How does it intersect? How does it involve itself in those type of gender norms?
Let me just jump in by saying there's no agreed upon definition of what reproductive coercion means, right? And so one can think about reproductive coercion at the level of, let's say, trying to avoid a pregnancy, which is, I think, the way we tend to think about reproductive coercion. So that could be a partner who doesn't want someone to use a contraceptive method, let's say does birth control sabotage, either pokes holes in condoms or disposes of someone's birth control method, and that person involuntarily becomes pregnant when they would desire not to be. I think that is probably the most traditional way in which we think about reproductive coercion.
Mm-hmm.
But reproductive coercion could also be I would like to continue a pregnancy, but I feel pressured by the person in my relationship. If for young people, that pressure tends to come more frequently from, let's say, a parent who understands that continuing a pregnancy at very young age potentially might impact the rest of their life. And so reproductive coercion could be sort of encouraging or forcing someone to have a pregnancy termination when that's not what they wanted to do. Those are sort of what we think about as sort of more interpersonal related forms of reproductive coercion, but there's also societal forms of reproductive coercion. So those could be things like, we know the number one reason most people have abortions in the United States is because they can't afford to have a child or another child. About 60% of people having abortions already have children, and raising children in this country is incredibly expensive. And for low income individuals, it's almost impossible to do. So people may feel like if things were different, if we had more of a social safety net, if we, provided more support for low income families, that people would continue a pregnancy that they had, that they found themselves, let's say unintentionally pregnant. But they feel sort of an economic coercion, right? That is a form of reproductive coercion. Simultaneously, we have what we call sort of cultural coercion, which is that somebody gets pregnant doesn't want to be pregnant, but lives in a community where they feel like that if they were to terminate their pregnancy, they would experience significant backlash. They would be, let's say, kicked out of their church. They might be kicked out of their family. And so they're coerced away from the decision to have an abortion by virtue of these sort of cultural or social factors. That's also a form of reproductive coercion. Mm-hmm. And what's true about all of these situations is that it is a set of pressures, whether those are individual or social or macroeconomic. People can't exercise their own reproductive autonomy, right? They can't not get pregnant when they don't want to get pregnant. They can't manage that pregnancy in a way that they want when they find themselves pregnant. And so I take a very broad view of the notion of reproductive coercion.
It's really interesting. And I think when people think about abortion and reproductive coercion, they don't take into account the multiple different ways that society can, and also culturally, they can be coerced to either have a child or not to have a child. It really takes away from the woman's autonomy. So
just add one more thing after having said that, is to remember that the third pillar of reproductive justice. So the first pillar is the right to have children. Second is the right not to have children. And the third is to have children and raise those children in safe environments. Gretchen Sisson has a brand new book out called Relinquished, in which she looks at people who find themselves pregnant, who would like to continue the pregnancies, but don't have the economic means to do so, and feel a sort of reproductive coercion into relinquishing their children for adoption.
Oh, wow.
So that is also a place where reproductive coercion happens, where, again, if social circumstances were different, people would want to raise their own children, but feel pressured and as if that they cannot raise their own children.
That's actually really interesting, because I personally have not taken that into account when thinking about obviously this topic, but abortion in general too. So kind of taking what you just said about the tactics and the common control over an individual's reproductive choices, in your research or observation, have you found there to be a negative impact of reproductive coercion on individuals and obviously their mental health, their health outcomes, and just their overall well-being? It could be common factors or anything that you've observed in research or anything personal as well.
Yeah. We've done a number of studies, my colleagues and I, over the years, that have looked at what we call decisional certainty, which is like when someone comes for an abortion, they go to a clinic or they reach out to a healthcare provider. How confident are they? How certain are they that this is the decision that they want? And the vast majority, 90%, 97% of people who seek abortions are certain about their decision. And then there are some people for whom they feel conflicted, but it's a small number of people. So we were very interested in understanding for whom after the abortion does coping not go well. Right. So we know that there is no evidence that people have long-term psychological sequelae. There's no such thing as post-abortion traumatic syndrome. It doesn't make people go crazy. It doesn't make people have mental health, crises events. But there are some people for whom coping after abortion is harder. And we were interested in understanding who those people were and what services they needed after an abortion. And what we found was sort of three things predicted the people who would have negative coping after an abortion. The first was just what you're studying, which is that they didn't feel that the abortion decision was their decision.
Got it.
So they felt, for some reason or another, whether that was a partner or a parent or a socioeconomic situation or just instability, let's say in housing or something like that, but they didn't feel like this was their decision, and they struggled more afterwards with sort of reconciling their abortion. So our recommendation from that study was really to provide the kind of post-abortion support that targeted the kinds of social and emotional support that people needed. And one thing I can say for the folks who are listening to this, so you want to share, is the problem is that most post-abortion support in the United States is provided by people who are highly judgmental of abortion, right? Mm-hmm. So the desire is to say, you need to reconcile with the fact that you did something wrong. Most of these people don't feel like they did anything wrong, but they aren't like they're struggling with it, right?
Yeah.
And so there's something called All Options. They have a national hotline. It is free. You can call it as many times as you want, and it is staffed by people whose job it is to help people, hear and walk through. There are also some individual counselors and therapists who are, very skilled at helping people, work through that. It's a small group of people, but it's a meaningful group of people.
Diving kind of into the whole post-abortion care and support, more into the policy realm of it, do you have any policy recommendations, or are there policies being put in place that can really pave the way for a more open and successful, and women feel more safe going to get abortion support services? Is there anything that the government can do in order to provide this for women or people who are seeking reproductive support systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing a government can do is require transparency of people's ideological positions. So there are organizations around the country called Pregnancy Crisis Centers, or CPCs, as they are listed. And they are predominantly run by religious institutions that have a negative perspective on abortion. But they often do not advertise that. And so when someone seeks out services, either before with a pregnancy or after an abortion, they do not find non-judgmental support. And one of the things that people have asked the government to do is to make sure that people know, where people are coming from. If you're not an organization that supports legal abortion, clients should know that before they come to you. That doesn't mean somebody might not seek services, but it does mean that people know what they're going to get. In the same way that, like, when you walk into a church, it's a church, right? There's a sign out front that tells you what it is.
Yeah.
You don't think you're going to a grocery store.
Yeah.
And so I think that is, one thing. The other thing is, what is true of healthcare generally is that mental health services are vastly underfunded in the United States. If I have learned anything from my 2 years here at American, it is how much need there is for behavioral health services, even amongst just populations not struggling with just struggling with the world. Right, with the post-COVID world, with life is hard and things are tough, but it's very hard to find services that people can afford. And so the government could fund more behavioral health services generally, which would benefit, obviously, people who are seeking services post-abortion.
It's really interesting because I know a lot of the issues surrounding abortion now are women who are getting them either illegally or in ways that can really affect their health. So it'd be really interesting to see the transparency aspect that you're talking about, if that would put an end to the crisis of women who are seeking for these reproductive services, who can't either get them or afford them due to the fact that there's predisposed bias surrounding abortion.
To your point about, so right now in this country, we have states that have have completely criminalized abortion, and then states that have sort of restricted abortion at a particular gestational age. And so when people need services outside of that context, they either need to travel out of state to get care at a facility, or they need to do what we call self-managed abortion. And that is usually done by accessing abortion pills through a variety of mechanisms. Now, it is perfectly safe, medically safe, to use those pills on your own. The World Health Organization endorses that practice. But when you do something that is criminal, that your state has told you is criminal, there is a mental health sort of burden that comes from engaging in that. So whether you're doing it and believing that you're doing something illegal inside your state, or you're driving long distances to access something that your state has told you is illegal, that has consequences for the way people imagine what they are engaging in. If you can just think about your own, sort of behavior, when you're doing something that somebody has told you you shouldn't, even if you know it's the right thing to do, it still carries a toll.
Yeah. I totally agree. I'm interested to kind of get your opinion and research on how the Commerce Clause is starting to criminalize abortion, well, crossing state lines and or taking someone to get an abortion. I'm kind of interested to see if in the government they had hoped that that would stop abortions in certain states. However, I'm interested to see if
It does.
yeah, or if it has a positive effect, because I know you're talking about the mental health aspect of believing you're doing something that it's criminal, which the Commerce Clause is now making it illegal to cross state lines to get an abortion.
Yeah, right now, it's still legal in
Mhm.
all states to to travel for
Got it.
services. Right now, states may be trying to impose travel bans, but currently the law of the land is that you have freedom to travel, assuming you're not on a restricted visa. Now, for some people, if you're, let's say you're on parole
Mhm.
and you're not allowed to leave the state because you're on parole, that's a different form of surveillance.
Mhm.
Or you have, let's say, an immigration visa that only allows you to be in a proximate area, traveling out of state. But it is a general matter, traveling for healthcare is not illegal. So states are trying to ban it, but right now that has never been upheld by courts.
Got it.
The other thing that they are trying to do inside states is intimidate people away from helping other people with this. So they're using what are called aiding and abetting laws.
Mhm.
So we can't. It's not just that you can't commit a crime yourself. You can't do something that encourages someone to cut a crime. So when we think about this, we usually think about, like, let's say you want to kill your husband, right? If you hire someone to kill your husband, now you might not have killed your husband, but you've aided
Yeah.
and abetted in this crime.
Mhm.
And so what the states are trying to say is, if I tell someone how to get out of state, how to get an abortion, how to buy pills online, I am aiding and abetting them in obtaining something illegal.
Got
Right
it.
now, those are just intimidation practices.
Mhm.
We have some lawsuits that are currently underway, but nobody has been formally convicted of aiding and abetting. And I think we'll see lawsuits that are trying to parse out that this activity is in fact not is a legal activity. It's not wrong to tell someone that they can get an abortion. It's not wrong to tell someone that they drive to Illinois, they can get that. It's not wrong to say, if I give you $600, you'll be able to get there and get your abortion. But the state governments are trying to intimidate people into not engaging in those behaviors.
Got it. That's really interesting. It'd be interesting to see what happens in the next few
What
years.
happens? Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of staying in the same realm of reproductive services for women, what kind of challenges are faced by individuals who are experiencing intimate partner violence, domestic violence under the umbrella of reproductive coercion, who are seeking access to that reproductive health care, including abortion services in your case as well?
Yeah, I mean, so there've only been a couple of studies that have looked at how frequent reproductive coercion contributes to the need for abortion. So that is whether or not someone's doing, birth control sabotage or forcing someone to have an abortion. So we don't have great data on how frequently that happens, but we do know that when you make abortion sort of more accessible to people for whom travel and is hard. So if you are in a highly coercive environment, you're not allowed to leave the house, right? Without that person knowing exactly where you're going. You don't have access to your own money. So getting out, driving across state lines to get an abortion, trying to figure out how you get enough money that you can, secretly get to get an abortion is particularly hard for people who are in highly controlled relationships. So when we have things like telemedicine medication abortion, where someone can go and visit a healthcare provider just like you and I are talking today through a telehealth portal, and they can get pills mailed to them at home, and they can have the fee for that waived. People in those tightly controlled environments may have access to abortion that they didn't historically have when they actually had to leave the home and access more money.
Yeah.
So there are innovations in healthcare delivery that are helping people who are in these controlled environments.
Mm.
The other thing we know about people in domestic violence situations is there was a big research project called the Turnaway Study, and it looked at people who sought abortions, were unable to get that abortion, denied the abortion because they were too far along when they went to get their abortion at that particular facility, and there was nobody else around. So they ended up having the baby. And they followed these women for 5 years, and they compared them to a group of women who showed up to the clinic who got the abortion. And they wanted to understand what's the difference about being denied an abortion. And one of the things they found was that people who were forced to have a baby that they didn't want, so this is looking at people who wanted abortions but weren't able to get them, they were more likely to be continued in that relationship with the violent partner because they couldn't, having children in a violent relationship is a tough thing to get out of, right? People often they'll hold the children hostage. They won't, there's multiple reasons why leaving is harder, especially when there's a baby involved.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one place where not being able to get a desired abortion has a big impact on people who experience intimate partner violence.
So also, especially in the gender argument, there can be reproductive coercion, obviously, against women, and women can also keep a child to stay in a relationship as well. So I think there's devil's advocate to be played, because I know at least my study, what I'm conducting, is mostly surrounding reproductive coercion against women, but it's also really important to note that it can happen to men as well, and people who identify as non-binary and things like that as well. Kind of wanted to talk about if there's any notable trends or patterns of reproductive coercion and abortion within different demographic groups, including race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and also now that I believe Roe v. Wade has been overturned, it's really important to talk about geographical region and especially different states.
Yeah.
So what's your perspective on that?
Unfortunately, we don't have any good data on this. The mechanisms by which we study populations tend to be funded by federal government investment, right? State government, federal government investment. That is how we conduct research. That's how we learn about healthcare outcomes. That's how we learn about populations. For a long time, the federal government and almost all state governments were sort of reticent to study anything that had to do with abortion. So you will look in the literature and you will not find studies on abortion, and in particular, the kinds of things that you're interested in, which is like, what are individuals experiencing, funded by the federal government. So almost all research on abortion was privately financed by a small group of philanthropic funders. And that just means there's not as much about as many sort of interesting and important subjects as we might need. I would love if people would take this issue up and really think about what structures of oppression and how do they interact with reproductive coercion. We know as a general matter, so back to the issues that we talked about people feeling, about birth control sabotage, about sort of coerced reproduction, whether that is to have an abortion or not have an abortion. Those things are more likely to occur. So African-American women are more likely to experience those because they tend to be, because of the way we have, structured our society, the long historical tale of racism in this country. Neighborhoods are more disrupted, family structures are more disrupted, partnerships are more disrupted. So there's lots of factors that go into the sort of creation of demographic communities that are more likely to experience everything, right? Intimate partner violence, violence in the street, carcerality, substance use. So those kinds of things tend to track with communities that we have deprived resources to over a long period of time.
Mhm.
And so that is true of reproductive coercion. We don't know about how that fits in with abortion,
Yeah.
um, in any kind of like real meaningful statistical way.
I would also agree with the lack of research in this area as well, based on doing my own personal research. It was um,
Yeah.
it was a deep dive, to say the least. It was very hard to find. So I know we kind of dived into this in the beginning, but I kind of wanted to get your perspective on if there's how reproductive coercion really manifests in an intimate partner relationship, and what are common tactics and used to exert control over an intimate partner, specifically regarding women in relationships.
I think you can think about it at every level, right? So the first is unwanted sexual activity, right? So feeling like you have to have sex when that is not what you would like to be having consent to.
Mhm.
Um, and then which birth control methods, if at all, birth control methods get to be used. So it could be the coercion that is like, you have to get an IUD. That's as much coercive as I won't let you use birth control pills, or, what we call stealthing, right? Which is that I think your partner is using a condom, and they have, removed that condom, and sort of intentional pregnancy, right? Which is a coercive tactic to keep somebody close to someone. I'm going to get you pregnant, and we are going to stay in this relationship. So it manifests, through from sex to contraceptive practices, and then what happens if one becomes pregnant, right? The ability to continue a pregnancy, the ability to have an abortion, the ability to parent a child, right? Feeling that um, feel the need to have to relinquish your child for adoption because you don't want that child brought into the violent or coercive relationship that you're engaged in, or wanting to relinquish your child and not having that right because that other person has parental authority rights. They would have to sign those rights as well. So not having the freedom to do what you want with your pregnancy.
Mhm.
And then, of course, coercion manifests in the post-pregnancy environment, right? As we talked about, like the ability to leave a relationship. And then what we don't think enough about is the role that the sort of state plays around coercion.
Mhm.
So if we think about what Dorothy Roberts, calls the family policing system, which is the way in which we surveil low-income families and we punish them for being poor, right? We remove their children. We mandate that they engage in certain behaviors. We give them a certain amount of food, and then we tell them how they have to, spend that food.
Mhm.
That people who are in those highly surveilled environments may feel that they need to have an abortion if they find themselves pregnant because they're worried that the state will take away their other children,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And this was true, let's say, on native lands for a very long time, where children were removed from native parents because the state thought it was in the best interest of those children, not to be raised in a native family, but to be repositioned, to go to a white school and or to be with a white family. So coercion, as sort of where we started, coercion can happen at this interpersonal level, but it can also happen at this state level, and
Yeah.
then it can happen at a social cultural level.
Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting because obviously, um, I feel there is not a lot of research in that area. And also, I don't think a lot of people think about it in that way, especially people who are in those intimate relationships. The state does play a role, especially in those family dynamics and socioeconomic status that are below the poverty line. I totally did not think about the fact that the state does have a lot of say in how they raise their families, how they live their life. It's really crazy to see, especially from an outside perspective of someone who was very privileged growing up. You don't see that kind of aspect, especially since my parents were able to have as many kids as they wanted as
Yeah,
they were able.
yeah.
So yeah, definitely
And
very.
I mean, we still have some states that have maximum family grants. So
Mm,
if you're a low income family and you are receiving public assistance from your state, you have a certain amount of money that you get.
mm,
If you have another child in the course of being on public assistance, you do not get any more money. It's called a maximum family grant. And these were promulgated in the 80s when there was the sort of trope that was being created that people were having babies in order to gain more financial assistance. It was a racist trope. It was geared at making people fear the government and fear low-income parents, in particular, fear Black women. And so they passed these laws that said, okay, if you're already on public assistance, you can't get any more money. So that means if you have a certain amount of money and you have 2 children and you're barely surviving, having a 3rd child, you're going to have to use the same amount of money and divide by 3 now. And so people who are concerned about these policies worry that what does that do to sort of encourage abortion among a population, because people know they can't, they can barely make it now. They're certainly not going to make it anymore. Those activists have been trying to get those laws removed. In California, this law was removed about 10 years ago, but it took 3 years of active work by advocates to get that law removed. And those laws still exist in other states.
Yeah. And 10 years ago is really not that far into the
Not that
past
long,
either.
yeah.
So that's certainly crazy. And I honestly think that it could just be me personally, but I feel like there should be more conversation surrounding this topic because and more studies done and just teaching. I think that's really important in this area. So to kind of wrap up, I kind of wanted to get your opinion on if there's key areas of research or actions that can be taken in the field of intimate partner violence, abortion, and reproductive coercion, kind of as reproductive coercion as the umbrella. What are some key things that we can do in the future to create?
Yeah, well, Elizabeth Miller's work from probably now 2 decades ago was very clear that when people are coming in for reproductive health services, we should be screening people for reproductive coercion, and we need to have good protocols associated with how to manage that. They did some trials looking at if reproductive health clinics were in deep relationship with what was then called domestic violence shelters. Could people be referred more easily back and forth? Like, could you, but asking people in reproductive health clinics to really take seriously reproductive coercion when people seek care. There are clinics that have taken this up, that have great practices associated with them, but it is not a reimbursable service, right? So if a clinic is barely making it, doesn't have enough money, they're going to streamline that front end service. So I would say we need to think more about what services people can offer in facilities. We need a lot more, as we said, behavioral health services for people who experience reproductive coercion, people who are not feeling like the reproductive decisions in their life belong to them. And so how to do that. There are interventions that have happened with clinicians, so that people can have a really honest conversation if somebody is in a situation where their partner is sabotaging their birth control. Something as practical as offering the person an IUD and cutting the strings very, very short so that it's not visible to their partner.
Wow.
And clinicians are not trying to help people stay in violent relationships, but they are trying to say, at this moment in time, I'm trying to help the client with what they are asking me for. And what they are asking me for is a birth control method that their partner cannot sabotage. So there are those kinds of options. And then I think we need to think about economic coercion, right? The kind of reproductive coercion that happens when people don't have the financial resources to have the children they want, to raise the children that they want, or even to obtain the abortion. We didn't even talk about the fact that in the United States, the federal Hyde Amendment, which is attached to the federal budget every year, prohibits Medicaid, which is the healthcare insurance for most low-income individuals in the United States, from paying for abortion. So in states where these prohibitions exist, about 25% of people don't get the desired abortion that they want because they can't afford to pay for it, because they can't use their health insurance. So thinking about the way in which policies, economic policies in particular, serve as a form of reproductive coercion,
Mm,
I think that that's super important work to do.
yeah, that's definitely, there's a lot to be done.
There
And
is, and I'm just so glad you're studying the topic
yeah, of
and
course.
raising the visibility. And,
Yeah,
I hope that you'll continue on it.
I know. I think it's really interesting. I think past this project in general, I know we're speaking about women mostly and intimate partner relationships, but going into the socioeconomic and the state provisions on
Mhm.
obviously not just abortion, but families and those who are low income. It's very interesting to see the different tiers of reproductive coercion that can happen, not just in an intimate relationship between, like we talked about in the beginning, friendships or relationships, family. It goes greater than that, which is something that's
Yeah.
really interesting and obviously something to look into after this project. I think that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to thank you for so much for taking the time
Sure.
today again
Yeah.
for speaking with me and giving your insights. I think they were really helpful and really, really interesting. And there's certainly a lot regarding this topic that
Yeah.
in today's political climate specifically that can be
Yeah.
extremely valuable. And I just wanted to thank you for being really open to my questions and answering
Sure.
them with your research and everything. So thank you so much.
Good luck with your project. Okay.